The SpongeBob movie Search for SquarePants was a resounding success in terms of being a meaningful and compelling story with deep themes and lessons. How did this movie achieve this, and what does this mean for the SpongeBob franchise as a whole? Chapter 1: The Setup. So quick minor spoiler warning, this section is not going to discuss major spoilers, but will be discussing much of the setup. So, like the first 20 minutes or so of the movie. Search for SquarePants revolves around two parallel character arcs, SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs, with the central theme revolving around self-identity. Both characters are presented as polar opposites on the spectrum of bravery and manliness, communicated through the imagery of being a swashbuckler. Some of the early scenes are dedicated to establishing SpongeBob's main want, being a big guy, which is used interchangeably with the term swashbuckler throughout the film. This main want is conveyed through SpongeBob checking his height and realizing he is finally 36 clams tall, and believes that he is now much more worthy of being considered a big guy because of that. Besides gaining overall more confidence in his new height, SpongeBob is also now allowed to ride this big roller coaster. But even though he is now tall enough to ride the coaster, he is too afraid to do so. All of the buildup in the early scenes that show his newfound confidence comes to a crash when his cowardice is shown in the face of the very thing he claimed to have wanted. It is through SpongeBob's fear of the roller coaster that Mr. Krabs is brought into the story. Not only in a literal sense, as SpongeBob's fake excuse for not riding the roller coaster is because he promised Mr. Krabs they would go together, which forces him and Patrick to go to the Krusty Krab, but also brings Mr. Krabs into the story thematically, as the scene with Krabs is the inciting incident of the emotional through line of the film. The scene sets up the dichotomy between SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs, as Krabs regales SpongeBob with tales of his youth as a swashbuckler. The main reason Krabs tells these stories is to deflect from SpongeBob's assumption that Krabs was much like him when he was younger, i.e. a bubble blower. What makes this scene so well crafted is the way in which it brings out the flaws of both of the characters in a believable and relatable way. It's a hard line to toe where you want to have a character be flawed without making them unlikable, and the scene achieves this by having Krabs tell the story of his past with the intention of making himself look better, not fully realizing that in doing this, he is putting SpongeBob down. If the scene had not had the deflection on Krabs' part, it not only wouldn't have served as a strong foundation for Krabs' own arc, but it also would have come off as too mean-spirited and too one-sided. So already we can see some similarities between the first SpongeBob movie and this one, mainly in the sense that SpongeBob has just about the same sort of character arc in both films. Just replace Manager of the Krusty Krab 2 with Swashbuckler. And honestly, I don't really mind that at all. As I said in my analysis of the first SpongeBob movie, link in the description, a character arc that revolves around SpongeBob challenging himself to be less childish and learning to embrace who he really is the best kind of story you could write with this character. As the heart of the SpongeBob franchise is that you don't have to abandon childish parts of yourself in order to grow up. You know, that's kind of the essence of the character. He does silly, childish things, but at the same time, he also has a job, a home, a pet, responsibilities. I really don't mind them retreading this same sort of story, especially because this movie has a lot of different elements to it in terms of execution. Chapter 2: The Execution. So, another spoiler warning, we are getting into more plot territory and we're going to be discussing pretty much all the way to the end of the movie in this section. You have been warned. So, with the foundation of the story's emotional crux set up, we get into the rising action of the film, which revolves around the main antagonist, the Flying Dutchman. Something the film does really well is laying out the gravitas of its conflict. The introduction to the Flying Dutchman is a great example of this, especially if you take into account what the typical SpongeBob fan might perceive in regards to the Flying Dutchman. So, in SpongeBob the show, while the Dutchman definitely has some spooky qualities to him, he is by and large a pretty humorous character, and most of his spookiness is usually played for laughs laughs when someone else undermines his supernatural power. When I think of the character, I usually think of him just getting annoyed by SpongeBob and Patrick's antics in Shanghai. And I think the team behind the movie was definitely aware of that perception and made sure to establish the Dutchman as a true formidable threat with his first appearance. The Flying Dutchman's main motivation is to use a pure soul to break his curse and become human again, with SpongeBob being the pure soul in question. It's kind of an inversion of the chosen one trope, but it works here because SpongeBob being a chosen one is actually to his detriment. There's an interesting dichotomy between Mr. Krabs and the Flying Dutchman as the two conflicting authority figures in the movie. Since the Flying Dutchman is trying to manipulate SpongeBob, he flatters him and tells him that he has what it takes to be a swashbuckler, even though he doesn't believe it himself. Whereas Mr. Krabs flatly tells SpongeBob he doesn't have what it takes. These are both bad ways to treat someone who looks up to you, obviously, but the main difference is that Mr. Krabs actually cares about SpongeBob, while the Dutchman doesn't. And I think the narrative does a great job of portraying the contrast between an authority figure who genuinely cares about you, but is also flawed and may hurt you because of their flaws, and an authority figure who just wants to use you, and how sometimes it may look backwards, with the caring authority figure seeming like the bad one and the bad one good. A great lesson, especially in a kids' movie. The bulk of the plot is divided into an A and B story, with the A story revolving around SpongeBob and Patrick going through a series of challenges in the underworld, and the B story revolving around Mr. Krabs, Squidward, and Gary trying to catch up to them before SpongeBob completes the challenges and has his soul snatched. To compare this to the first movie, it does give us a bit more character variety, as SpongeBob and Patrick themselves dominated most of the runtime of the first film, while this one has a pretty good mix of most of the major characters. But there are two major characters who were left completely on the sidelines: Plankton and Sandy. Technically they're in the movie, but they only kind of have a few lines each. So Plankton, I don't really mind taking a backseat, because since the villain of this film is the Flying Dutchman, I'm not really sure what Plankton would do in the movie, and Plankton himself also isn't really any friend to SpongeBob anyway, so he wouldn't really be too concerned with the events of this plot. However, I can't say I wasn't disappointed that Sandy found herself just sidelined in this movie. And this is made even worse by the fact that she was sidelined in the first movie too. On one hand, I get it. The hard part about having Sandy be in a narrative like this is that she's just too competent. So much of the humor of the movie revolves around these characters kind of blubbering around with all these dangerous monsters. And Sandy, as a character, just doesn't really vibe with that. She wouldn't really have too much trouble with these monsters at all. It's also a too many cooks situation, because if she did tag along with Krabs and Squidward and Gary, the whole thing would just get kind of muddled, and she'd kinda clash with Krabs as the leader of their crew. Squidward and Gary, being the main companions to Krabs, helped Krabs' own character arc shine, because their presence allows Krabs to bounce off of them and express his feelings towards them as he undergoes his character arc. But they also don't overshadow him as the more major character in these B-story scenes. Krabs' two companions play specific roles in the side of the story, with Squidward being more of a comic relief character, and Gary is a reminder to Mr. Krabs about why he's on the quest to save SpongeBob. Since Gary's SpongeBob's pet, there's, a connection there. This Gary connection is most concisely communicated by having Gary give Mr. Krabs SpongeBob's first Krusty Krab ID card to remind him what he's fighting for. So back to Sandy, there was this one weird part where the movie cut away to the realistic looking fish, and it did some kind of meta joke where he was like an executive, and he said, "We need more star power in this movie. Let's get Sandy in there." Like, I guess they were self-aware that they knew she wasn't really used much in the movie, so I was like, oh, that's a clever way to include her in the plot, but then she appeared and she, glitched out. So I guess she was supposed to be a simulation. I was really confused. I had no idea what was going on. Whatever they were trying to communicate, it just did not read to me. It went right over my head. This is probably the only part of the movie that I would say was fundamentally flawed. Anyway, let me know in the comments below if you think that there's a way they could have used Sandy more in the movie. I also want to shout out the character of the Flying Dutchman's first mate, Barb. This character faced an uphill battle, as she is the only major character in the film that isn't a pre-established SpongeBob character. But I think they wrote her really well as the typical, not as evil as the big bad henchman kinda character. I think what sold me on this character is that in one of the earliest scenes with the Dutchman, there's this moment where she's talking about SpongeBob and Patrick screwing things up, and she says something along the lines of it having to do with them like being friends or something. I don't remember the exact line. But then the Dutchman is like, that's why we get along so well. We were never friends. And she's just like so hurt. And it made me root for her. She also has this kind of adversarial relationship with Patrick where she keeps being the brunt of Patrick's shenanigans, but then by the end of the movie, she ends up actually respecting Patrick after the Dutchman inevitably betrays her. I thought she added a good layer to the elements of the story revolving around the Dutchman and SpongeBob and Patrick's friendship. So, a major part of SpongeBob's character arc is his desire to be more like how Mr. Krabs described himself in the past. In the first challenge, when it seems like he's about to fail miserably, he gets hit on the head and goes into this dream sequence where the young Mr. Krabs tells him, "Do what I do." And it's this kind of who's on first bit where SpongeBob keeps, misunderstanding who I is. But it gets clarified that it is in fact SpongeBob who needs to act more like Mr. Krabs. This leads to SpongeBob completing the challenges by morphing into this Mr. Krabs imitation and finding success in unorthodox ways. What I like about the way the challenges are written is that SpongeBob never completes a challenge by being stronger than anything else. He always succeeds in a unique and creative way, showing that you can still be a swashbuckler even if you don't entirely fit the exact physical attributes that society expects of you. This change in SpongeBob's attitude has negative consequences in the form of how SpongeBob treats Patrick. In an attempt to break the two of them up, Dutchman manipulates SpongeBob into rejecting bubble blowing and, by extension, rejecting Patrick, which adds emotional weight to this change in personality, shows SpongeBob as a flawed character, and further teaches the lesson that one shouldn't go too far in changing themselves because they can end up losing themselves. Then, once Mr. Krabs catches up to SpongeBob, he is forced to admit that he wasn't really a swashbuckler in his youth, and the story that was told at the beginning was a lie. This changes how SpongeBob approaches himself in the final act of the film, which takes place on the surface world against human form Flying Dutchman from Ghost SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs. They switch bodies. I get it, Dutchman became human, they became ghosts. The final conflict appropriately happens on a roller coaster, showing that SpongeBob has overcome his cowardice he felt at the beginning of the film. There's a callback to that earlier "do what I do" scene where Mr. Krabs, the real Mr. Krabs, not the dream perception of him that exists in SpongeBob's mind, tells SpongeBob to do what he would do, meaning SpongeBob do what SpongeBob would do. Be yourself. Character arc complete. After defeating the Dutchman and relegating him to become the fry cook under the new captain, Barb, go Barb, the respective character arcs of SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs come to a close with SpongeBob learning to be more brave while still embracing the more childish parts of him, and Mr. Krabs accepting his own past as not as much of a manly man as he wanted to be seen as. Their arcs are tied together when SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs blow bubbles together, something I think Mr. Krabs has never done in the show itself. Chapter 3. Heart. So the story of the film is really solid. It has high stakes, deep themes, good lessons, and strong character arcs. These are all the academic ingredients for a successful film. But what about what might be the most important part of any creative product? The heart. After all, SpongeBob, like many franchises that have gone on for so long, has lost a lot of heart. So, is Search for SquarePants any different? Yes, the movie has a lot of heart. The film does a really great job at selling all the important character relationships. I really believe SpongeBob and Patrick's friendship. I believe how hurt SpongeBob is by Krabs' insult and how much Krabs himself regrets his actions. How are these things accomplished? It's hard for me to exactly remember what lines and moments made me feel this way. After all, I saw the movie in the theater. I couldn't exactly pause and listen to each line like I usually do when I make these videos, but there were definitely some key moments and lines throughout the movie that convey these character relationships in just the right way to make you believe it. Let me know in the comments if any specific lines from the movie come to mind that you think might have accomplished this. So let's talk about the humor. Since I was keeping up with the advertising of this movie, I was definitely expecting butt jokes the movie. And there were a lot of butt jokes. But you know what? I think they were all earned. I'm pretty sure I laughed at every single one. You know, when they put them all in a row in the advertising, you think it's going to be a bit too much, but over the feature-length runtime, they really don't overstay their welcome, and they work with the plot. I mean, seriously, they do. They work with the plot. They're used to make SpongeBob and Patrick appear sillier, and these two being goofballs is a major part of the conflict. A lot of other bits of humor in the movie revolve around slapstick and pacing disruptions. It's a difficult line to toe when you're doing like an action scene or an emotional scene and you drop a well-placed joke in there, because you can risk ruining the feeling you've worked so hard to achieve. So there's this one action sequence where Mr. Krabs and Squidward are running the basement of the Krusty Krab to try and stop SpongeBob from going with the Dutchman. And the journey to the basement has them go through this labyrinth of stairs, and there's this one moment where there's just all these stairs going every which way, and it zooms out to show that it's actually a painting. And Squidward is like, weird place for a painting. And that joke succeeds. One, because it's funny enough to justify the disruption of the pacing, and two, because even though it disrupts the pacing, it still feeds into the feeling of the scene, which is being lost and confused trying to get to a place within a strict time limit. Another example is during an emotional scene. It's actually the scene where SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs got turned into ghosts after the Dutchman turned human. And they're all sad, and the lights dim, and it's revealed that Patrick is just pushing down a dimmer switch. And usually I hate when jokes happen in emotional scenes because it's an indication that the movie doesn't want you to fully feel something and is attempting to pad the emotion with humor. But that isn't a problem with this joke because, one, it doesn't really disrupt the moment much because Patrick doesn't call attention to the dimmer switch, and two, this isn't the most emotional part of this scene, as the bigger emotional moments like SpongeBob learning Mr. Krabs lied about his past and the Dutchman betraying him happened earlier, and no jokes disrupted those big moments. But the big thing about this movie that really sold it for me was that it just felt like a SpongeBob experience. Now, of course, what does that even mean? I mean, it's such a broad claim. What does it mean for something to feel like SpongeBob? Isn't anything that is SpongeBob, SpongeBob? And sure, there is definitely a bit of familiarity bias to my perception of this as a more SpongeBob-y piece of media, but I do think that, on average, there are elements of the show that are pretty well ingrained to be SpongeBob-ish, and this movie succeeds at them. One thing I got sold on fast was the animation. I'm definitely someone who's been skeptical of some of the art design changes away from 2D animation that we've been seeing in a lot of SpongeBob media lately, most notably the movies. I even went so far to say that the Plankton movie should have been 2D animated, as it would have told its story better. But I do not feel the same way about Search for SquarePants. This movie needed to be told with this specific art style. The way the characters move and express themselves, as well as the gravitas of the monsters of the underworld and all that stuff, was enhanced by this 3D art style. It's the first time I ever got why an animated movie based on a 2D animated series should have 3D animation. It elevated the experience and made it feel like it was something distinct from the base show. There are also so many strong underwater elements that tied the movie together. Since the Flying Dutchman was the villain, we got lots and lots of pirate imagery. In fact, this is probably the most piratey a piece of SpongeBob media has ever been. But really, what might have been my favorite part of the movie was the live action segment at the end. So when Dutchman becomes human, he doesn't plot to take over the world. He just wants to screw around at Santa Monica Pier. A hilariously petty villain motivation. So because it's SpongeBob, the surface world is live action, and since this is a modern movie, I was expecting it to be, you know, like a modern movie, all well filmed and well lit or whatever. I know, boring. But no. It looked kitschy. It looked kind of low budget. Now, maybe it just actually was low budget, but honestly, I think it all really worked. Like, there was a scene where the human form Dutchman just goes around wreaking havoc, and it's filmed in front of the worst green screen ever. It's so obvious that it's a green screen, but that just made the whole scene funnier. I do think that that particular sequence looked intentionally low budget to sell the jokes more, because there are some green screen scenes later that look a little better. The surface world sequence really helped tie the whole movie together for me. It was campy, quirky, funny, and at the same time, it raised the stakes by taking these characters out of the ocean where they usually belong. Chapter 4: Comparisons. So let's address what might be the central question posed by the thumbnail of this video. Is Search for SquarePants better than the first SpongeBob movie? That is, if that was even the thumbnail you saw when you clicked on this video, as I'm doing like one of those thumbnail tests, so you might have seen a different one. Seriously, these little images can make or break a video. Being a YouTuber is hard. But let's ask ourselves the question, which movie is better? Well, both films contain just about all of the things that I believe are required for good storytelling, being clear and concise stakes, deep themes, good lessons, strong character arcs, and the more subjective and harder to define, heart. In that regard, both movies get a perfect score. But what would I rate them out of 10? Out of 100%? Out of 5 stars? Well, I don't really rate things using numbers. Why would I? Words are far more effective. I really can't say much more about these two movies other than they both do exactly what they are supposed to do, and they both succeed as a proper story. Perhaps if I really wanted to answer the question, I could watch both movies with a pen and paper and count the amount of times I laughed, or I could count the amount of lines and moments I consider good, and I don't know, I could hook up some electrodes to my brain that objectively track the amount of joy I'm feeling, and then we might get an answer. Beyond that, if I claimed the first film was better, I wouldn't know if it was just because of nostalgia and how long the first film has been with me in my life. And if I claimed the newest one was better, it could perhaps only be because it personally made me happy that this franchise can still put out good content. So if you did see this as the thumbnail of the video, it was probably just because it was sensationalist enough to get a higher click-through rate than the others. Please forgive me. Like I said, being a YouTuber is hard. The SpongeBob Movie Search for SquarePants is a breath of fresh air in a media landscape that is becoming increasingly worse, with lowest common denominator content getting pushed to the top, big franchises, SpongeBob included, realizing they can get away with weak stories because they're too big to fail, and attempts by corporations to normalize the use of generative AI in creative fields to further suck any remaining humanity out of their products. With all that nonsense going on, it really is nice to sit down in a movie theater and watch a new release that was filled with intentional deep writing, glorious and precise art design, and all-around heart. Hey, thank you so much for watching. I got a great video recommendation for you. Why don't you check out my Flying Dutchman ranking video? That way you'll have a complete look about how I feel about everything to do with the Flying Dutchman. Also, please consider supporting my Patreon or becoming a channel member.